Kate Filcher, 1,000 welcomes to the Village Oak Tree for May 22nd, 2024. I'm your host, Terrence O'Donnell, and I'm returning to your village again with an interview with Sean Carlton. He's a podcaster, he's got a Substack page, a few other things. So the big thing about this is we're going to discuss kind of what's going on in the United States these days and a little bit how that may be affecting him because he's a lot younger than I am. So with that, let me bring him on and let's kind of go from there. Hi, Sean.
Hi, Terrence. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. So the big thing is here, and I sent you questions to preview. So
Right.
you didn't edit any, so I got to assume that they're all good.
They're all good.
Right, no issues. And again, you still have the option to modify as you please. I don't want to step on any toes, but the big thing is I introduced you being a podcaster, and I kind of reviewed your Substack page a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't delve deep into it because I figured you'd do that for us. So I kind of want to know what kind of topics do you talk about? I mean, you're a physical fitness person, I
Right.
guess. So tell us a little bit about what you do in your Substack page.
Well, kind of going off of the fact that I'm a personal trainer, a fitness instructor. That's kind of where my first podcast came from. So my very first podcast, and I now have 3 podcasts. My first one was called Fitness Reborn with Sean. So it was just kind of like, I think my intention with it was to be kind of like an adjunct to my fitness business. So I figured that, it would be such a cool thing to talk to people who are knowledgeable in the fitness space, who are actual movers and shakers, or people who are just brand new to it and kind of found their calling in a way, and just kind of learn from them and just kind of connect with them. And from that, like the people listening, namely my clients, would learn more from other people than they would say just going to me, because I've never held myself up as the kind of the all-knowing resource about fitness. I've been very upfront with that. So when people ask me questions, and people tend to ask you a lot of questions when you're a fitness trainer, I've been very forthright about the fact that, I don't have the answer for that right now, but I'll look it up.
There you go.
And that's just kind of been my default answer to things that just kind of stump me. So I thought, well, instead of me doing everything, why don't I just try to find other people who can, do a little bit for me, and maybe have been around more than I have been around longer than I have know more than I do. And yeah, we just kind of jump off from there and kind of have a give and take conversation where I'm just asking a lot of questions, and they're just giving me their knowledge and their history and their experience. And so it just kind of took off from there. And so that was my first foray into the podcasting world. I sort of just did it on a whim. I didn't plan on it. I just kind of this was during COVID. This is now 2 years ago, May of 2022. And I was like, well, why not start a podcast? Seems like it's a cool thing to do. It seems like a lot of people do it. I was big into podcasts myself. So I just sort of ramshackled a bunch of things together. I downloaded some cheap software. I had a laptop already, some cheap software. Eventually got a microphone, and I signed up for this podcasting matching platform called Podmatch. Shout out to Podmatch. Well, you're on it too. So yeah, you know about it. Yeah. And it's a great resource. I've loved it ever since. And it's done wonders for me. And so now I've just made one connection after another, and it just kind of blew up from there, man. And I just really got hooked on it.
That's good. That's good. I've got kind of mixed feelings as far as Podmatch goes. I mean, it has been a resource for me as far as, finding guests for the podcast. The thing is, I'm kind of a niche podcaster in a lot of ways because I'm an activist. I'm pro-Palestinian, and I spent a lot of time in the Middle East during my military days, and I saw all the bad things that you could possibly see over there. And I actually have personal experience with the IDF and it wasn't great.
Really?
So that was back in 1985. But the thing about that was that I came away with that with a mindset, and I stewed on it, let it sit for a few years, and of course, all that kind of boiled over about 6 months ago when I saw everything was going on.
Hmm.
Um, I've been to more than one Middle Eastern country, and the bad thing about it is what most Americans never get to see about that is the other side. Okay. So, for example, I spent a year in Dubai, but everybody knows all about the tourist brochures from Dubai over in the UAE, the big tall skyscrapers, all the gold and glitter, the fancy cars, and all that kind of stuff. Well, you know what? You need to get away from that part of town and get into where the real people live, and you'll see a huge inequality gap between the haves and have-nots, and it's really bad. Um, they actually treat people who are not native born, UAE people, like slaves and all that kind of stuff. So those are the kind of things that don't make it into the tourist brochures.
For
um,
sure.
I spent a year in Afghanistan, and again, same thing. The big army guys were down in Kandahar and Bagram Air Force Base in Kabul, and they never really stepped out of their compounds that much to actually see the real people. But I spent a year up in the Northeast quadrant where we were outnumbered like about, 50 to 1, and had to keep a really low profile. So when you're got long hair and a beard and wearing native clothing, trying really hard to not get shot and killed by the Taliban, it puts a different perspective on you as far as how you interact with the local people. And, you know, at the end of my tour, obviously I came home and I tried hard to keep in touch with the people that I, got real friends with over there. And of course, Afghanistan being the way it is, there was no such thing as mail, which I found out the hard way. I couldn't get a letter in. So that didn't work out so great. So again, the whole thing was I came away with a different mindset. So when I returned home to the United States, and I messed around and did this and that, I still kept that attitude of like, okay, the Americans, they really have no idea what's going on over there. And so I've been an activist ever since. And that's kind of been what this program is about as well, is that I I don't want to push you in a corner in any
Hmm.
way, because I
Right.
try not to solicit your personal views on things because things get misconstrued. I do all of that. I'll do that for you. Okay. I'm
Okay.
all about beating the drum and saying, "Hey, you're doing something really bad over there." But the big thing for me today is I want to get your perspective because you're a lot younger than I am. Now, I'm almost 70. So there's a huge age difference and what I call a cultural difference
Hmm.
in how you were raised. You're from the Midwest. I've been everywhere. So I can't really count my perspective. My world perspective is going to be a lot different than somebody who's not traveled outside the United States very much, if at all. And secondly, my age difference is going to be a lot different from somebody in your age group or younger. Now, I say that only because I have grown up children. I've got grandkids. Now, my grandkids are not really old enough to have any opinions about anything, but my children, my oldest son just turned is in his mid 40s. And unfortunately, he's also ex-army, but I don't know what with him, and nothing against my son, but he has really no opinions about anything. All he cares about is going through his daily life, making sure he survives from one day to the next. He can put food on the table, yada yada yada. And I'm like, okay, I get that. It's your choice. You know what I mean? Now my other son, second son, a couple years younger than my oldest, lives out in East Texas, and he's very opinionated. He's just the opposite of his brother. So much so that he's a little radical, even a little bit too radical for me. I mean, he has a lot of very strong opinions about things, not necessarily agreeable ones, and sometimes, but he is what it is. But I got thinking about that. I says, okay, so I have, my two oldest sons are like dark and sunlight and dark as far as the way they think about things. My daughter, on the other hand, who's even 3 or 4 years younger than they are, she's the same way. Like her older brother, she just goes to work every day. She has some opinions about certain things, but she tries to stay out of it because she has a very sensitive job down there in Florida. And I can't even tell you what it is. It's not that it's classified or anything. It's just that who she works for, if she did do anything political or in any kind of an activist type of thing, she could lose her job very quickly
Mm,
because of who she works for. So I keep that in mind whenever I have a conversation with her. I try not to identify her or where she works, things like that, so she'll stay out of trouble. Obviously, I don't want to be the cause of her losing her job.
right.
I mean, she's a doctor. She's got a PhD, so I don't want to rock her boat.
Hmm.
And I'm okay with that. So same thing with you. I mean, I don't want to rock your boat either. Okay, but I do want to get a feel for today how all of this stuff that's going on, student protests, stuff that's going on in Gaza, stuff that's going on in Ukraine, you look at all of that in general, how is that affecting your peer group and your lifestyle out there where you live?
Well, I think that for the most part, as far as the Ukraine crisis is concerned, I think most people that I know are they are heavily in favor of the Ukrainians.
Mhm.
Um, and I even do know that we have a few what you might call Ukrainian refugees in this town that I live in. Now they may not be refugees in the traditional sense, like they weren't really given political asylum or anything like that, but they were here doing whatever, visiting friends or relatives or whatever, and then this war broke up,
Mhm.
and then they can't go home. So they're just stuck here. So now
Right.
they're trying to make a life here as much as they can because they just can't go back to where their entire lives are at. So now they're in the position where they have to rebuild a whole new
Yeah.
life for themselves here. So, and I think generally people view Vladimir Putin as being a real villain, and they don't really understand him. They don't understand what he's doing. I still don't clearly really have a clear understanding of why he's invaded Ukraine. I mean, I understand that Ukraine used to be a satellite, a part of the Soviet Empire, but so were a lot of countries. Why isn't he invading
Right.
them? I just don't understand it. Now, I could probably dig into it a little bit and find out why exactly he looked at the Ukraine in particular. Um, but as far as that conflict goes, as much as people do take sides in a war, in a foreign war, where they have no deliberate or direct hand into it, or maybe they do, probably with all the
Mhm.
foreign aid going that way. Um, it's definitely for the Ukrainians. Now, for the whole thing about the flare up in the Gaza Strip between the Palestinians and the Israelis,
Yeah.
uh, I think it's probably an even mix, honestly. I think there's a lot of kind of built-in sympathy for the Palestinians, and there probably is the same for the Israelis. And whether
Mhm.
that is justified or not is a matter of opinion. So, you hear a lot about how rockets are fired from the Gaza Strip or fired from the West Bank into the Israelis, and it hits a pizza parlor and it kills,
Sure.
women and children, stuff like that. And so that naturally provokes sympathies
Mhm.
from people who want to believe that Israel just wants to exist and it just wants to be in peace, and that there's just this built-in belligerency that just will not cooperate or will not agree to their right to exist or something like that. So, I would say that it's at least evenly divided on that end. Uh, and then for my own part, like I'm pretty sympathetic to the Palestinian causes, and I have been for a long time, and for the Arab causes itself. I
Mhm.
even remember. Do you remember like 10 years ago with the so-called Arab Spring?
Yeah.
That led to the I think it probably bled over from the whole crisis in Syria, right?
Yeah.
With what was his name, Bashar or
Bashar.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so that gained momentum, and it bled over into Egypt. It got into Mubarak being removed and all that. Um, it was a pretty exciting thing to witness. And you kind of like, if you were sympathetic and you were someone in the knowledge of, or in the know about American history in the Middle East, and um, even going far back after, the founding of Israel, and even, continuously from that point on, you kind of thought, wow, maybe this is actually a different world emerging here. I don't know if that is really what it came down to. um, I think, once it went away, you really never heard about it again, and I think probably things settled back into its old ways. Um, what was it? Wasn't it the Muslim Brotherhood that took over after Mubarak got ousted from Egypt?
I'll be honest with you. There's so many factions over there; it's hard to keep track.
Yeah, I think
It,
I think I heard something like, it was the
and it may have
officially
been. It may
um,
have been. To be honest with you. I
officially
mean, they've changed hands so many times over there. It's hard to say. And now, they got another authoritarian guy that's
right.
running show, and it's like, okay, someday he's going to be gone, and who knows? And that's the bad. That's what's really wrong with the Palestinian problem. I was watching something this morning, and they noted that, back in the 60s and even the early 70s, the Arab nations backed Palestine. But Israel was backed so heavily by the West that nobody could get up against them. They tried, the 67 war, the
Hmm.
6 Day War was obvious what happened. Nobody could go up against the military, the American military equipment that the Israelis suddenly found themselves with. And, it was all over from there. But it goes back, it goes way back even further than that. But the thing is, we really don't want to go down 100 years ago of what happened over in Gaza. What was Palestine back then?
Hmm.
And there's a lot of things that transpired that the West instigated through the years.
Right.
And the only reason they did it was for their own benefit. Okay. England was the instigator up until World War II. The United States took over in 1948, and things kind of went from there. But the U.S. support of, and that's the biggest thing. Everybody pretty much kind of put blinders on when it came to apartheid and the Gaza Strip, and we all knew what was going on, but we put our blinders on and said, "Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, but we're helpless to do anything about it," and everybody ignored it. So we had this thing. We've had several little flare-ups, a couple of intifadas, some other things, and now October, and it's been an ongoing thing for 100 years. So I'm not surprised, truthfully, that this happened, because it's just another one of those that happened like in years previous. The only difference was that Israel finally decided enough's enough. You killed enough of our people this time, where we're going to go full on you, and you're done. So the big thing about it is, what everybody has to realize is, if you don't pay attention to American news, you get the real story. So
Hmm.
Al Jazeera obviously is the biggest one on the ground over there. And I pay a lot of attention to their news journalists, the ones that aren't being killed, to get the story out. And some of the other ones as well. I mean, most of them, though, it's mostly Al Jazeera. Of course, they're out of there now, too. They just got kicked out recently, but that's another story. The big thing is, I learned a long time ago not to pay attention to the United States news, because they're all in the pocket of the politicians. And the reason I say that is because when I was in Afghanistan in 2002, for about 3 weeks, we hosted some American reporters where my team was hooched at. And they flat told me straight up that the American government, this is in 2002, they told me straight up that the American State Department was telling them exactly what they could report and what they couldn't report. They were only allowed to publish certain stories, and they had to be vetted by the State Department. So I said, so we can't go out, we can't roll out to a village that's got a bunch of sick people in it, and you want to write about the humanitarian issues. No, we're not allowed to report that. I said, okay. So if I go to take you to another village, and with noted, Taliban sympathizers out there, yeah, we're not allowed to go there either. I'm like, okay, so what are you allowed to report? And then they gave me a laundry list of what they called PR, public relations projects, schools,
Mhm.
various other humanitarian projects in the town that we were in. That's the only thing that the State Department would allow them to report on. And I said, okay, so whatever happened to freedom of the press? Oh yeah, no, forget about that. This is what a reporter from the New York Times told me. He
Mhm.
said, forget about freedom of the press. We're told what we can report, what we can't report. And even though if we write up a story and send it in, it won't get published. And then we'll get for writing the story. I'm
Hmm.
like, okay, now, yeah, like I said, that's 2002.
Yeah.
So in 2003, the Washington Post got publicly rebuked for writing stories on the Iraq invasion. George W., who was president at the time, flat out in the public news told the Washington Post, "You write any more stories like the ones you just did, and we're going to come down on you." So obviously the WAPO backed off, and there you have it right there. And it's been
Mhm.
that way. And I've talked to other people, and they told me that, yeah, even though you experienced that yourself, and of course 2003 was all in the news, but all of that lack of freedom of the press, the First Amendment, basically, that goes back 100 years or more, where the press basically is told by the government, this is what you can write up, this is what you can report, and no, you can't do that. And it got really bad in the 50s when J. Edgar Hoover was running the FBI. It was
Yeah.
really bad. So,
Yeah.
the First Amendment in the United States is a joke. I mean, that was the subject of yesterday's podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in some ways you are absolutely correct about that. I mean, and let's see. All right. So I was 18 years old when 9/11 happened.
Hmm.
Okay, so I was 18 years old. I was fresh out of high school, and I remember the whole build up to the Iraq War. I remember, there was the invasion of Afghanistan, the ousting of the Taliban, right?
Hmm.
Which just forced them into the mountains.
That's all it did.
All it did is just force them back into the mountains, and they waited there for 20 years until they took control back in what, in
Well, they didn't wait that
2021?
long.
Well, I mean, they officially took the country back, what, in 21,
Well, yeah,
2021, something
that's
like that.
true.
Yeah,
So let
yeah.
me tell you a little story about how that worked out. So in 2001,
Okay,
we chased, like you said, that we chased. Then we teamed up with the Northern Alliance, which the
right.
CIA was backing, and chased the Taliban up into the mountains, just like you said. So let me give you an idea how that worked out. So in the town of Talaquan in northeastern Afghanistan, and the other town, little city of Kunduz, when the Taliban factions up there surrendered to the Northern Alliance, they got told, bring your guns, drop them into town square, and go home. Okay. So in Afghanistan, well, let me give you an example. Here in the United States, almost most people who live in the country have some sort of a rifle, hunting rifle. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, Shotguns or something. Okay. Unless you're stupid and got an AR-15. But, it really doesn't really matter. We have some sort of a hunting rifle in our cabinet somewhere. I mean, I'm guilty of that. But the big thing is over there in Afghanistan, because of the market, if you will, they can buy a cheap Chinese made Kalashnikov for chump change. And that's their idea of a squirrel gun. Okay. Everybody has one. So dropping what these weapons that they supposedly dropped in the town square, when we asked about that, they said, oh, yeah, they dropped all these World War II Enfields and English Enfields and muskets and all kinds of stuff in the town square and said, okay, we surrender. Here's our weapons. Go. Well, what nobody really knows for sure was what all they dropped these old weapons off. They still had AR-15s, or they still had Kalashnikovs at home. They still had them, and nobody took them away from them. So they just waited and did their thing. So about almost 15 years now, the Taliban started creeping back in to places that we had pulled out of. So
Hmm.
the Northeast Quadrant, where I used to work at 2002, got taken over by the Taliban because the NATO forces had pulled back. The same thing in the Western provinces over there in Herat. Same thing. The Iranians were coming over with satchels full of cash saying, hey, we want to give you cash and do all these humanitarian projects. And they chased the Americans out. And that was while we were still on the ground over there in 2002. So again, over the course of time, NATO pulled back out of the areas. They concentrated on Kandahar and Kabul and Bagram and those areas, and sent everybody, all the troops up into Helmand province and all their surrounding areas down to the border, but left the northern part of the country alone. Well, Mazar Sharif, Kunduz, Talakwan, Herat all got taken over very quickly by the Taliban. They didn't, and it never made it in the news unless you went digging for it. Right now, because I had been there, I went and dug for it and I found this stuff out. But again, it never made it to mainstream news USA. So I'm like, okay, that's fine. Let it happen. Well, so when the takeover of Bagram and Kabul happened, it's only because they had already taken over the rest of the country. Okay. It was just a foregone conclusion that they were actually going to muster up and get it done. The big fight was around Kandahar because that's where we had the biggest concentration of troops outside of Bagram and Kabul. But again, it was a matter of politics, and we decided, okay, we've been here long enough, time to go home.
Yeah.
Which, that's another argument too. We were there initially to do what we had to do in 2002 and maybe even 2003, stayed a little bit. But truthfully, based on my own personal experience over there, we should have never stayed past 2003. But like I said, I don't make policy, and I'm just a soldier. You know what I mean?
Right.
I don't have any say in that kind of stuff. So what happened? We got our butts spanked, and it didn't have to have been that way. Okay. The same thing in Iraq. We overstayed our welcome there by huge amounts and killed a lot more people than we had to, simply because we decided that, we're going to be the big bad boys and go do what we do. And, and right now, Iraq is doing everything it possibly can to kick us out of their country. And the United States is digging their feet in and saying, no, we need to defeat ISIS. And Iraq is saying, no, we got this. Okay. Go home. Yankee, go home. I mean, it doesn't get any more blatant than that, but the United States is still saying, hey, we're going to stay here. Well, I'm thinking something's going to give here very soon. I'm waiting to see, probably within the next 6 months to a year, we're going to get told very blatantly in Iraq, you need to go home and stay gone. We don't want you.
Wasn't that the whole?
They're telling us that now, but they're going to actually enforce it somehow.
Wasn't that the whole kind of purpose of us going over there in the first place? It was to get rid of Saddam and then build the country back up so they could stand on their own feet.
No, that's the lie that you.
That I know that was the line they gave us, in addition to many others like weapons of mass destruction and all that stuff.
Well, no. So let me tell you about the weapons of mass destruction deal. Saddam actually did have some, but he got rid of them. Okay. He got rid of them long before we decided to go there in 2003. But what he did was he dumped them out in the desert. Okay. And the wind took them and blew them all over the Persian Gulf. So he actually had, and I say this only because I'm one of those poor saps that there's a good possibility that I got infected with this stuff. Neurotoxins he dumped out in the desert out there, and it turned to dust and blew out across the Persian Gulf. And those of us who had Gulf War symptoms, if you will, and even some of the other stuff, they're now saying that, oh yeah, well, we found out that it's probably a real deal. You guys got exposed to nerve toxins. Okay. But that's a whole nother story for veterans. Finding out 20 years later, oh yeah, you got exposed to something. Have a nice life. But the big thing is, I was in Afghanistan when the buildup was going on. And the thing about that was, we had a satellite dish on our house that we were told to live in over there. And every once in a while, the wind would blow just right, and we could point it in the right direction, and we could get a good satellite feed somewhere. And most of the news, well, all of the news, I will say almost all of the news I got when I could get it came from Al Jazeera in Qatar. And their narrative on why we invaded is completely different than what got told to the American public. Okay.
For sure.
And well, to be honest with you, it was about George. It was all about George W. Every bit of it. Okay. Him and his cronies. It was about going after Saddam's oil. And it was about taking out Saddam because of what happened in the first Gulf War, and so on and so forth. But mostly it was about George W. And his huge ego and all that, because he was an idiot and a coward. And that's a whole nother thing. So I won't really go down that rabbit hole. But the big thing about it, that's what it was all about. Because in the proof of the pudding is, when the troops got dispersed, we had a general at part of the Joint Chief of Staff back then. His name was General Sincheki. And he flat out told everybody, hey, if you're going to do this, you got to have enough troops on the ground to secure the borders. Because if you don't, we're going to get overrun. Well, Rumsfeld said, nah, poof, you're nothing. You're fired. And that was the end of his career. Meanwhile, they put troops on the ground over there, and the first place they dispersed all the troops, including the English troops. They sent the English troops to Basra to secure the spigots, basically is what I call it, where the oil gets loaded into the ships. And they sent the American troops out to secure all the oil wells and all the oil fields. They didn't send anybody to the borders. So here we are, guarding all these oil fields and all these pipelines and the port in Basra. And what happens? Al-Qaeda rolls in across the borders and sets up shop. And next thing you know, we spent 20 years fighting terrorists. And that's the real deal for Iraq. And of course, George W. goes on the aircraft carrier, says, oh, mission accomplished. Yeah, right. You're an idiot.
Made for a good spectacle at the time, though, right?
Well, that was, like I said, that whole deal was all about him and his boys. Okay, had nothing to do with
right. And you look back on it, you realize, yeah, you really did only hear one story out of potentially hundreds. You heard, and it was the same story over and over again, and everyone was on board with it. Even the supposed liberal stalwarts like the New York Times and stuff like that, they got completely on board with it, and they sold you the story. They sold you the story that was sanctioned by the government. So
that's right, and that's the way it's been. The worst part is that over the last probably 25 years, they have gotten more blatant about it. And as I said, in yesterday's podcast, this idea of freedom of the press, that disappeared years ago, decades ago. And now they're just in your face about it because nobody's slapping them on the hand saying you can't do that. You're breaking the law. Well, nobody's telling them that they're breaking the law. So they're running with it. As long as they're going to keep running with it, we keep losing our freedoms. And this goes back to some of the other stuff. So here we bring this back to the United States with the student protests. So we have the right, according to the First Amendment, to peaceful protest. Okay. We have the right to air grievances with the government. It's written in the Constitution in the First Amendment. So what's going on the campuses? Well, you're not old enough to remember, but I am old enough to remember the campus riots and stuff back in 1968, 69, 70, stuff like that. Now, I was a teenager back then, but I'm old enough to remember those things. And so when the campus riots started occurring here, within the last 2 or 3 months, I thought to myself, go for it. Go. I hope I hope you are as good as your parents and grandparents who were doing it back then. And so far, they seem to be managing fairly well to a degree, but as expected. And what I think is a plus, because it's not happening coast to coast. It's only happening on specific certain campuses. Of course, the cops get called in. I call them the bone crushers because they are special police, riot police. They have military equipment. They're trained in military tactics and all this kind of stuff. And according to a bunch of reports, some of them were trained by the IDF. Go figure. Now, I don't know how true that is, but that story's been running. But either way, these guys are coming in and cleaning things up and, hurting people and putting people in jail and all kinds of stuff. And a lot of bad things are happening to these students, which I feel bad for. I'm hoping in this case that they were able to see this coming and prepare for it. I hope. Some of them maybe not, but I hope enough of them were able to prepare themselves personally to expect this kind of stuff, and they can move on in, hopefully it hasn't totally ruined their lives. But meanwhile, some of the other campuses have actually embraced this. They say, hey, as long as you're peaceful, we'll let you do your thing. And some of the colleges are actually starting to divest their holdings in these things that meeting students' demands. And I'm thinking, okay, that is the way it's supposed to work. Okay. Negotiate with this if it's in the school's best interest and you can do it without, having to close the doors. Great. I think it's the way it should be. And, I think to myself, where's this freedom of speech? Where is this right to peaceful protest? Well, obviously it's good for some and not good for others. And it's applied on whoever's in charge of the school. So instead of a blanket, civil right do we have, we apply to you, or you can have it or not. Okay.
Mm.
And it's one of my favorite mantras. If you want to know what's wrong with something, follow the money. Okay. You'll notice that the campuses who are cracking down on the students are the ones who stand to lose the most money, because donors and benefactors and however they get their money are saying, oh, no, too much publicity for us. We're backing out. We're taking our money away. Well, of course, obviously the school administrators can't have that. So they're going to crack down on the students, clean up the mess, and say, okay, we're all good now. Bring your money back. Keep paying for us.
Right. Well, where do you see all that happening with all the student protests and things like that? These flare-ups all around the country. I mean, it's and some of them are more aggressive than others. I've noticed.
Right.
Others are some are very peaceful and very you don't hear about them a whole lot because there's not much to really talk about. A bunch of kids,
Exactly.
protesting very peacefully in a non-harmful way. Where's the news? So, but then you hear about the ones that do erupt in violence, or the ones that do erupt in vandalism, like I don't know, like somebody vandalizing a statue of George Washington and stuff like that,
Right.
and then that just kind of riles everyone else, and then it looks like
Mhm.
anti-Americanism and yada yada
Right.
yada. Do you think there's any? So I'll turn the tables here. Do you think there's anything different about this one as opposed to ones we've seen in the past?
No, truthfully, not. Okay. I mean, the idea is that the students now are copying their forebears.
Right.
Okay.
Hmm.
And that's the way it's supposed to be. There should be allowed to do that. Okay. And what happened in 1968 at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago is repeating itself at Cambridge, UCLA, Alabama, Emory College and all that kind of stuff, simply because it's about money. Okay.
Hmm.
The college campuses that are not worried about losing money are the ones who are allowing the students to peacefully do their sit-ins and their protests and stuff. Some of them are actually negotiating, some are not. They're just letting the students do their thing. One of the biggest ones was Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. Now, obviously, they kind of copied the Americans, but it's a good thing because the students actually got to college to make the changes needed. Now, I will admit that they were somewhat already on that plan, because the Republic of Ireland as a whole, population-wise, had been pro-Palestinian from the beginning. So it's not a real hard stretch for the students at Trinity College over there to get the administration to say, hey, let's fix this. They're kind of an exception to the rest of it. On the other side, you go across the Irish Sea, the UK basically is mimicking the United States. Some college campuses were okay. They did their little demonstrations and stuff. As long as nobody got out of hand, the Metro Police stood around them and monitored them and so on. Some of the campuses, on the other hand, the administrators said, no, we can't have that, clean it up and crack down on them, so on and so forth. So they're almost a mirror image of the United States. Some campuses did, some of them didn't. And again, it goes back to money. And here in the United States, what I really hope to see is they're going to see it through. Okay. I want to see the campuses across the country see it through. Don't don't leave. Okay. Don't leave until you get what you want. If all you college students agree that the colleges themselves should divest their investments from the Israeli interests and the industrial, the military industrial complex and whatever it is that you're doing and all that, then go for it. Stay there until you see it get done. Okay. Don't give up. On the other hand, for the colleges that the police came in and did really bad things to you, don't let them get away with it. Okay. So if you can't do it on campus, find some other public place within where you're as you have reasonably easy access to and keep doing it. Okay. Now, obviously, you're not going to go to a city park and set up tents, but you can do protests. You can march around with your signs. You can do your rallies. You're supposed to be allowed to do that here in this country. I want to find out is, are you going to be able to do that? And that would be my suggestion. If all the students at the college campuses, they get routed out of the campus themselves, find another public place within the city that you're in and keep doing it. Just keep going. Don't give up. Whatever happens, don't give up. That's the number one thing. Don't give up. Hopefully it'll make change. Hopefully. I mean, it took a few years, until Nixon got dethroned. And we, end up doing our thing. But, I would like to think that all the protesters back then had an effect on policy back then. And I'm hoping that things will do, they'll do the same thing here. Well, we'll see.
But it never seems to stick, does it?
No.
It's a moment in time.
Yep.
It has some change. It has some consequences. It does kind of propagate some change, and it's noteworthy, the changes that do happen. Like,
Right.
you get a president that is forced to resign or something like that. That's pretty huge. That is a real wielding of appreciable power.
Right.
But yeah, okay, Nixon got kicked out, or he kicked himself out, however way you want to look at it. But
he got fired.
Yeah, he got fired. He resigned. All right, but then what happens? 6 years later, his party roars back into power, and it's a new decade of conservatism. It's all the turbulence of the 60s and 70s was like it never even happened. It's like people wanted to forget about it, right? So it's like it shows up, but it never really hangs on very well. It doesn't stick. Only thing that really sticks, it seems like, is just the idealism. But the actual nuts and bolts, just kind of the whole machine itself, seems to crumble and rust away, over time, because I don't know. And so, and then just kind of going back to what I said earlier about the Arab Spring and how it looked like it was hopeful, and it looked like, damn, yeah, all this stuff is happening in Syria and Egypt, and going back to what you said earlier about how the news, the media manipulates depictions of things here. You had a lot, especially in Egypt and Cairo, of American or Western reporters talking to people there who are happy to see him go, and always. The people who they're talking to speak flawless English. They're obviously educated. They're obviously, probably an upper middle class stock. And, that's maybe about 2% of the entire Egyptian population. The other 98% are illiterate, poor, and maybe more than just a few of them were probably big Mubarak backers. So yeah, if you want to talk about like just absolutely skewing depictions of things and just kind of really just manufacturing an entire scenario, there you go.
Right. Well, the big thing about it, a little bit of history too. The United States, especially since the 1950s, has been famous for creating and or instigating coups in other countries
Mm-hmm.
to make things more favorable to the United States. And again, it's all about the money. Okay.
Right.
They did these things in South America during Reagan days, and even before that in the 50s over in Eastern Europe and East Germany and all that kind of stuff. And it was all about money. Okay. So when the spoils of war at the end of World War II were being divided up, Germany especially, it was divided up basically between England, United States, and Russia. Okay.
Right.
And Russia wanted more than what the other two are willing to give them. And so that's a lot of where the fighting started. And it kind of, went downhill from there through the decades.
Well, they probably thought they deserved it more since they had more casualties than the other guys did.
Well, see, that was the thing. It wasn't about how many people died. I mean, the Russians lost over 20 million people. Okay. And the Americans, World War II soldiers, I think came a little over to 1 million. England, obviously having a lesser population, lost. But, the big thing about it is, yes, Russia lost a lot more. The worst part was Russians wanted revenge for all those 20 million dead. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So they were wanting to, Stalin, being the dictator kind of guy that he was, wanted to roll, and he wanted all of Germany. He wanted to roll all the way up to France. And obviously the West wasn't going to let him do that. And so that's where everything kind of broke down. But, that's that history. The idea is, though, the United States is famous for instigating stuff for their own benefit and still are today. And they're getting in a lot of trouble for it. And that's what's going on with Gaza right now, is that we backed Israel years ago and we're stuck with it. The worst part is, I have to think that Joe Biden right now is caught in a vice. His people before him made a lot of promises to Israel, and Israel's lobbies are very strong. They have a lot of leverage, and I'm not talking about financial leverage, although there is a lot of that. It's not just financial leverage. I will tell you a little story. Back in the 90s, the United States arrested an Israeli spy, a Mossad spy, for spying on American politicians. They spanked him on the hand, sent him back to Israel. Okay. It was a thing in the news back then. And there was another American who got caught spying for the Israelis, and they put him in jail here. So the thing about it is, those are the ones that made it in the news. All right. How many other ones didn't make it in the news? How many years have Israel been spying on the Americans? Probably for decades, ever since the 1960s. All right. So how much what the Russians call compromat has the Mossad dug up on individual American families and politicians here? So you have to know that when Biden started getting cold feet about sending stuff and continuing with Israel's war machine right now, how much do you think Israel said, hey, we know stuff about you people. You're going to give us what we want, or we're going to let it all hang out. So part of that is going to be George W.'s war crimes. Okay. And they have to have intimate knowledge of certain things that never made it in the news. I have intimate knowledge of certain things that never made it in the news, but because I'm an American citizen, I'm still held under, the Classified Information Act. I'm still considered a soldier, even though I'm almost 70. So I could go to jail if I told people stuff. Israel, on the other hand, they don't have to worry about that. They can say anything they want to. So I have to feel that there's got to be something to that. They've got some leverage on the Americans. Okay. And they said, you either give us what we want or we're going to let it all out. So here we are. Okay. I have to say that something's going on. And we won't know for 20 years. It'll come out someday, in about 15, 20 years. Oh yeah, back then, but it is what it is. Meanwhile, we're stuck. Okay. We're obviously, supporting a genocide and somewhat ethnic. But you see where I'm getting at is that despite the public opinion in the United States of what's going on over there, the United States government in Washington is basically got their feet to the fire and they're being held to account by the Israelis. I just know this. Okay. Now, there's never, obviously, a guy like me, guy like you, we'll never be able to prove it. All right.
Right.
I saw a lot of things that, back in my military days, and I'm like, okay, is what it is. But I'm always worried about the guys in the dark coats and the flat hats coming to pay me a visit someday and saying, "Hey, we're with the FBI. You need to come with us." I'm like, oh, I don't want that to happen.
That's a scary idea. Let me tell you.
Well, believe it or not, it has happened, a long time. Like I said, J. Edgar Hoover was famous for that back in the 50s, back when Senator Joe McCarthy was running around with the communist scare. That was a big thing in the 50s and in the 60s. Not quite as much in the 60s, because of the administration we had. And then it ramped up again in the 70s. I know some guys that were talked to in the 80s, me being one of them. I had a talking to by the FBI in 1983. So no, the guys in the funny hats and in the dark long raincoats and the suits, they are a real thing. They are really a thing. Not very much, but they are there. So it's something that we have to think about, and it goes back to what I was saying about First Amendment rights. Okay, so I want to close up shop here in the next 5 minutes or so.
Mm-hmm.
I want to get your take from your end. I mean, with everything that's going on in the next 6 months, okay, so leading up into November and say between now and January, for example, I mean, I've heard a lot of stories about Iowa in general, okay,
Mm-hmm.
as far as what people are saying out there about things, but in your demographic, as far as where you're at, and I'm not talking about just because you live where you live, simply because of the people you hang out with, for example. All right. Your family, your people that you hang out with there where you live. I mean, are they worried about the election in November?
I think probably to some degree, yes. A lot of people a lot of people I know do not wish to see Trump get reelected. And Iowa is heavily Trump.
Yes.
It's kind of, in certain areas, you kind of think that it's not because, it's more of an urbanite population and they tend to be more Democratic. They tend to be more liberal. But, the state of Iowa is heavily red state controlled. It's a Republican governor, 2 Republican senators, all the members of Congress are Republicans. It's a red state. It used to be kind of considered a purple state, because they did go for Obama 2 times, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at one point it was kind of like considered a swing state. I don't think it's a swing state at all anymore. I think it's deeply red. And when it comes time, and if Trump is the nominee, it's going to go for Trump. I'm positive of it. There's no question in my mind about that. If that is who they nominate, who knows? I don't know. He's on trial for what that really matters to the people who back him. The people who support him are not very level-headed to begin with. So
No.
the fact that he's on trial, I don't think is going to dampen their enthusiasm for him. But as far as Joe Biden is concerned, though, with the elections coming up in November and such, I think it's really weird, though, because it seems like he wants to kind of turn this down a little bit as much as he can, because it does seem like it's getting him a lot of bad press, because like we spoke about before with the college campuses protests and people calling him Genocide Joe and that kind of stuff here, too. It seems like he wants to really kind of remove himself from that overall image that he is supporting apartheid and genocide and that sort of thing here too. And he does not want a large scale military conflict. He seems like he wants to do everything possible to avoid that.
Right.
Now I think that is exceptional for a sitting president who's going into an election, instead of like looking for ways to engage militarily, because we do know in the past that does increase your odds of being reelected. You have an advantage anyway of being a sitting president. Always has an advantage, not save for Trump, who got kicked out after one term.
Right.
But a sitting president typically, historically, does have an advantage going into a new election of getting reelected.
Hmm.
And that is usually the case. And now, if there's a war going on or some sort of conflict, some sort of rally behind the flag sort of event sort of thing going on,
Right.
and even more so, it seems like he doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to go that way. It seems like he wants to go the other direction and avoid that if he can. So I think that is interesting. Just looking from a historical point of view, I think that is interesting. Um, Now, as far as people who are like outwardly concerned, um, I think, yeah, there probably is a lot of trepidation going into the election. There probably is a lot of worry about, namely Trump getting back in. For the people that I know, I
Hmm.
also know that there are people out there who are worried about Biden staying.
Right.
So it's I think it's I don't think we're really experiencing it right now. I don't think it's really reached fever pitch in terms of how the election people concerned about how the election is going to turn out. I think as we get closer to it, we're going to see a lot more. We're going to hear a lot more anxiety. We're going to hear a lot more speculation. I think right now it's far enough into the future that people aren't thinking about it as much. They're kind of like a lot of what your kids are doing. They're just kind
Yeah.
of living day by day, and they might have their opinions. But once we get a month away, a couple of weeks away, their opinions are probably going to spike. You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. And that's fine. I agree with you. It usually is that way. Everybody just kind of mopes along, reads the news, and say, "Yeah, okay, whatever," until crunch time. Crunch time being like 2 or 3 weeks out from election day.
Mhm.
October is going to be a crazy month, I think.
Yeah, it
Um,
really is. And I don't know, it doesn't really I think people going into an election when it gets to be about a month away or about a week away, people's minds are made up. You're not going to
yeah,
turn them.
true.
If they're going to vote for who they vote for. It's just that, and that's when all the candidates start to really kind of like hit the accelerator
Yeah,
and make sure that they are going to cross the finish line first here. It's almost
right.
like you might as well just chill out and see what happens because there's nothing's really going to change between now and then, this close to it.
Well, it's heartening a little bit to hear you say that everybody's kind of, like you said, chilling out a little bit, waiting for things to kind of fold out as they will. And I'm
Mhm.
kind of like that too. I mean, obviously, I'm anxious um, a little bit, but not overly so. But I'm kind of paying more attention to what's going on overseas than I am, New York right now. Whatever happens in New York is going to happen. And same thing in Georgia. We don't know what's going to happen in Georgia, and they're not even close to even putting him on trial yet. They may be waiting for him to finish up in New York. Who knows? Whatever unfolds, hope unfolds. I mean,
Right.
we actually had a presidential candidate that made it to the primaries, and he was actually in jail. This was about 50 some years ago. Um, so it's not going to hold Trump back if he's wearing an orange jumpsuit from running for election. Now, he won't get elected, obviously, but he could make it. He could make it through the RNC.
You don't think he has any chance of getting elected again?
I think it's going to be if he managed to stay out of jail. I think it's going to be really close. The big
Yeah,
question is he going to stay out of jail?
I don't have any faith that he's going to go to jail. I'm just going to say
No,
that
I
right
agree.
now. I do
At
not
the
I do
most, I think at the most they'll send him down to Mar-a-Lago with an ankle bracelet and tell him to
right.
behave himself.
Yeah, and I do not I sorry, I don't think that a billionaire white male is going to go to jail.
Right.
Unless he got actually caught extreme like really red-handed, like on video, actually like butchering someone to death.
Right.
And even then, you think about Rodney King, you got all these people on camera beating a man, and they still get acquitted. I mean, it's just
Yep.
like I don't know. It kind of reminds me like these people, uh, the people who think that, oh yeah, this is really happening. He's gonna go to jail finally. I'm like, it really?
Nah.
I can't. I look at this and I think about Pablo Escobar building his own prison and then negotiating with the Colombian government saying, okay, I'm in prison. This is my prison now. And it's a palace.
Right.
That's what it brings to mind for me,
And you're right. And I think that's probably how it would be for him if he did get convicted and told, said, all right, you are now a criminal. You can't run for office. You're done. They'll send you down to Mar-a-Lago with an ankle bracelet and say, okay, finish out your sentence down here. Stay, they'll tell him, stay out of the public eye, keep your mouth shut, yada, yada, yada. And we're going to take all your social media toys away from you and you're done. And truthfully, I'd be okay with that. To be honest with you, if they could just get him to shut his mouth and stay in Florida, I think the world would be a happier place. But who knows? We'll have to wait and see. So, all right. Well, listen, we're at the top of the hour. So I want to thank you very much for coming on the show. And I appreciate your insights on all this stuff. I truly do. I kind of imparted a little bit of history to you and kind of brought you up to speed on some things.
It was interesting. It's really interesting to hear someone's experiences who are, we're now talking 20 years ago in Afghanistan and how things were depicted. I of course did not know about that. I was not over there. So to hear that's really eye-opening and frightening. I'm going to tell you.
Yeah. Well, the big thing about that is if I had been a soldier back then, even so, but I had never went there, just stayed stateside, I wouldn't have been able to say any of that either. Because again, what got told here never made it over there. And, I had a reporter from the New York Times. I had another one from Fox News, a video reporter, and a third one, I forget what newspaper he was from. And then we had Army Times. We had four of them. They're all there with us. And the Army Times guy was the exception because obviously he was writing strictly for Army News. But the other three, they all told us, the New York Times especially, because he was an actual journalist. But the other three told us all that, we got told of what we can report, what we can't report, what we can write up, what we can't write up. And sorry, that's the end of that. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, it's about all you can say. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it definitely put me in a different perspective as far as that. And then, of course, we had a lot of other things going on at the team same time. And after that, I started putting two and two together. And then I got told I had a bad attitude. I'm like, okay, yeah. Like I said, that's another story in itself. But the big thing is, it's been an interesting ride the last 20 years. Up until I went to Afghanistan, I was a good soldier. Followed orders, didn't ask questions, and things dramatically took a turn when I got home, and I've been that way ever since. So I'm going to keep on keeping on, until the FBI shows up and says you can't do that anymore. All right.
No, listen, hopefully you don't.
Yeah, I hope not either. I don't think it'll come to that. But I appreciate you, okay?
I appreciate you having me on.
I want to thank my guest, Sean Carlton, founder of Dark Age Media and Samo Lives, for coming on the show today. His insights and worldview give us all a little hope that things may get better for all of us if we work together for the common good. As I close things out this week, I want to tell our leaders around the world that most of us want peace, to live our lives without fear and hunger. As leaders of the free world, for now, you have the opportunity to stop the madness. Pick up the phone, bring an end to the bloodshed being spilled over power and money. Sláinte. Thank you for listening to the show today. I hope you enjoyed it and that you'll return again next week for another episode of the Village Oak Tree. This is Shawnee. I hope you will continue to let me come to your village to bring you some news from the outside that might make you think a wee bit. Please share this podcast with your friends and relations. The more you share, the more we can convince enough people to make a better place to live in here around the world. As I say goodbye this week, I wish to leave you with this Irish blessing as you go about your day. May your hand always be stretched out in friendship and never in want. Slán go fóill.